From young bride Margaret Wilson, economics degree relegated to a decorative function, to Margaret Hampton, perfect corporate wife with a secret financial life, to simply Margaret Wilson again, financial educator, foundation founder, woman fully. Herself at last. The $3.7 million portfolio, once my most closely guarded secret, had evolved from escape fund to philanthropic resource. The financial acumen, once carefully hidden, had become my most valuable public contribution. The independence, once a distant dream deferred for decades, had blossomed into a life richer in purpose and authentic connection than I could have imagined. Outside my window, Philadelphia spread before me, not the city of my youth or married life, but the city I had chosen for myself. Inside, the foundation celebration continued, voices blending in animated discussion of financial education initiatives, investment strategies for women, pathways to economic empowerment. I thought of George's dismissive anniversary toast one final time. Margaret has never contributed anything but her time. He had been wrong in ways he could never fully comprehend. I had contributed intelligence, strategic thinking, financial discipline, maternal guidance, community service. I had contributed most profoundly by finally claiming my own value, by demonstrating that a woman's worth extends far beyond her service to others. Now, in this unexpected final chapter of my life, I was contributing something equally important, proof that it is never too late to become yourself. That financial independence enables not just security, but significance. That a woman who values herself creates ripples of possibility for every woman who follows. My secret $3.7 million portfolio had purchased more than freedom from an unsatisfying marriage. It had bought the opportunity to live authentically, to share hard-won wisdom, to transform private financial acumen into public empowerment. As I rejoined my guests, accepting their congratulations and enthusiasm for the Foundation's mission, I silently thanked my younger self, that determined young woman who had opened a separate bank account with $50 and began the patient, methodical process of building independence, one careful decision at a time. She could never have envisioned this outcome. Margaret Wilson at 73, surrounded by colleagues and supporters, launching a foundation, reconciling with her children, living entirely on her own terms. But she had believed something essential that sustained her through 50 years of secret financial building, that her capabilities mattered, that her future deserved planning, that she was worth the investment. In the end, that belief had proven the most valuable asset in my portfolio. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. As I described the Foundation's mission to my assembled guests, I felt a sense of purpose that had eluded me throughout decades of maintaining the Hampton family image. This was not about social standing or community impression. It was about transforming my hard-won financial knowledge and independence into meaningful opportunity for women facing similar constraints. My story is unusual only in its outcome, not its circumstances, I explained to the gathering. Countless women manage household finances with unrecognized skill, stretch limited budgets with creative ingenuity, make financial sacrifices that go unacknowledged. The Foundation aims to validate those capabilities while providing pathways to develop them into true economic power. Later, as guests mingled on my terrace overlooking the park, Elizabeth approached with an expression I hadn't seen since her childhood, a mixture of curiosity and tentative pride. "You've created something significant," she observed, gesturing toward the animated conversations among Foundation board members and supporters. "Something that will outlast both of us." "That's the hope," I acknowledged, "that women's financial empowerment becomes the expectation rather than the exception." Elizabeth hesitated, then added softly, "I'm proud of you, Mom. I didn't understand at first. You're leaving, the secret portfolio, this new life. It seemed selfish, disruptive, unnecessary. And now? I prompted when she paused. Now I see it was necessary. Not just for you, but as an example for women like me. She glanced away, then back with newfound directness. I've opened my own separate investment account. Nothing dramatic, just a small portfolio that's entirely mine. James doesn't know. Yet. The admission stunned me. My achievement-oriented, rule-following daughter taking this small but significant step toward financial autonomy within her own marriage. Not that my marriage is like yours and Dad's, she added quickly. James isn't controlling exactly. He just assumes certain things about who handles the money, who makes investment decisions. I understand, I assured her, resisting the urge to over-advise. Elizabeth would find her own path, make her own choices about balancing marital harmony with personal agency. The important thing was that she now recognized financial independence as an option worth pursuing, not a betrayal of family loyalty. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself standing once again at my wall of windows, this time with William beside me, both of us watching the city lights emerge against the darkening sky. You know what I keep thinking about? He said, after a comfortable silence. That anniversary toast. Dad standing there with his champagne, declaring you had never contributed anything but your time. I smiled at the memory, no longer painful, but instructive. An unfortunate choice of words. The ultimate irony, William continued, is that you've contributed more in 1 year of independence than in 50 years of marriage. This foundation will help countless women. Your workshops have already changed lives. Your keynote speech is still circulating online, inspiring women nationwide, all because I finally valued my own capabilities enough to claim them publicly. I reflected. Exactly. William squeezed my shoulder gently. At 73, you're having more impact than most people half your age. As my son rejoined the gathering, I remained by the window, contemplating the extraordinary trajectory that had brought me to this moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A good one. I could help you design an appropriate vehicle for your philanthropic goals. The offer represented more than financial expertise. It signaled Elizabeth's growing acceptance of my independent identity and resources. A professional. Acknowledgement of capabilities she had never associated with her traditional mother. I'd appreciate that, I said sincerely. Later, after my children had departed with promises of more frequent visits, I stood at my wall of windows overlooking Rittenhouse Square. The park gleamed under streetlights, spring foliage creating intricate patterns of shadow and illumination. In the reflection of the glass, I studied my own image. A woman transformed not just by external circumstances, but by internal liberation. 1 year ago, I had been preparing for a golden anniversary celebration that would culminate in George's dismissive toast. 1 year ago, I had still been Mrs. Hampton, defined primarily by my relationship to a successful man. 1 year ago, my financial acumen had remained my most closely guarded secret, my capabilities hidden even from those closest to me. Now I stood in my own carefully chosen home, having delivered a keynote address to a national conference with the nucleus of reconciliation established with my children. Most significantly, I had settled into an identity entirely my own, neither defined by nor in reaction to the marriage I had left behind. The divorce was finalized the following week, the settlement proceeding exactly as Patricia had negotiated. George retained the Cedar Grove home, his retirement accounts, and all jointly acquired assets. I kept my separate portfolio, now valued at nearly $4 million thanks to continued market appreciation, and my personal possessions. The agreement included no ongoing financial entanglements, no alimony, no shared investments, a clean and complete separation. Patricia forwarded George's signed documents with a congratulatory note. Official as of today. Congratulations on your new beginning, Ms. Wilson. I traced my maiden name on the final page, feeling a sense of completion rather than celebration. 50 years of marriage deserved acknowledgement, even if its conclusion had become necessary for my authentic self to emerge. George and I had built a family together, raised children who, despite their different reactions to our separation, remained the greatest accomplishment of our shared life. That evening, I received an unexpected message from George, the first direct communication since our courthouse encounter months earlier. "Elizabeth shared the video of your keynote address," he wrote. "I hardly recognize the woman speaking with such authority. Perhaps I never truly knew you. For that, looking back, I find I am sorry. G." The message was brief, lacking flowery apologies or dramatic declarations. Yet in its simplicity, it acknowledged something profound, that the woman he had lived with for 50 years had possessed depths and capabilities he had never bothered to discover, that his perception had been limited by his expectations, that somewhere along our shared journey, an opportunity had been missed. I considered how to respond, if at all. No reply seemed necessary. We had said our final words in that courthouse hallway. Yet something in the message's understated recognition compelled acknowledgement. "We become what others expect of us," I wrote finally, "until we don't. I wish you well, George. M." With that exchange, the last thread connecting us severed cleanly. Not with drama or recrimination, but with the quiet recognition that we had moved irrevocably into separate futures. George with his new relationship and familiar Cedar Grove life, albeit with greater appreciation for the infrastructure I had once provided. Me with my Philadelphia existence, financial education work, and expanding sense of possibility. 2 months later, on a warm summer evening, I hosted a gathering that would have been unimaginable during my Cedar Grove years. In my Rittenhouse Square condominium, a diverse group assembled: women from my financial workshops, colleagues from the Empowerment Conference, my financial advisor Diane, my attorney Patricia, William and his family visiting from Chicago, and, yes, Elizabeth, who had come alone but with genuine interest in this aspect of my new life. The occasion was the formal announcement of the Margaret Wilson Foundation for Women's Financial Empowerment, established with an initial endowment of $2 million from my portfolio. Elizabeth had indeed helped structure the foundation for maximum impact, applying her banking expertise to ensure the resources would support 3 key initiatives: financial literacy, education for underserved women, research into barriers to female economic participation, and direct assistance for women transitioning from financial dependency to autonomy. Hampton has been consistently adversarial throughout the proceedings. This sudden cooperation suggests external influence. I smiled, suspecting Elizabeth's hand in this development. Perhaps our dinner conversation had affected her more profoundly than I'd realized, prompting her to advocate for a less contentious resolution with her father. The conference itself proved transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. Held at Philadelphia's prestigious convention center, it attracted over 1,000 women across various financial fields: investment advisors, banking executives, financial educators, entrepreneurs. For 2 days, I attended workshops and panel discussions, absorbing perspectives from women who had built successful careers in domains that had been largely closed to me in my youth. On the final evening, I prepared to deliver my keynote. The ballroom was filled beyond capacity, according to the nervous event coordinator who escorted me backstage. "Standing room only," she reported. "Your story has created quite a buzz." From the wings, I surveyed the audience, my attention immediately drawn to the front row where William sat beside, to my astonishment, Elizabeth. They had come together, my son and daughter, to witness this unexpected chapter in their mother's life. When the moment came, I walked onto the stage with a confidence that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The spotlight that would once have terrified me now felt like an opportunity to share not just my financial journey, but the deeper transformation it represented. Financial independence begins not with money, but with mindset, I began, addressing the rapt audience, with the radical notion that your economic existence matters, that your financial capabilities deserve development, that your future security is worth planning for, even when, especially when, traditional structures discourage you from doing so. I shared my story without embellishment or apology, the young bride whose economics degree was relegated to the guest bathroom wall, the mother who stretched household budgets to generate investment capital, the wife who built financial literacy through decades of careful self-education. I maintained absolute financial secrecy for 50 years, I acknowledged. Not because secrecy is inherently desirable, but because it was necessary within the constraints of my particular marriage. The optimal approach for each woman will differ, according to her specific circumstances. What remains constant is the importance of creating financial agency by whatever means available. Throughout the address, I outlined practical strategies for building financial independence from various starting points. For young women just beginning their careers, for mothers managing family finances, for women contemplating major life transitions, for those in partnerships where financial authority is unevenly distributed. The greatest barrier to women's financial empowerment isn't lack of capability, I concluded. It's lack of confidence, the insidious belief that money management is beyond our natural aptitude. That belief is not accidental. It's cultivated by systems that benefit from our financial dependence. Rejecting it is the first and most essential step toward building true economic security. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, a response that overwhelmed me with its intensity. As I made my way off stage, women approached with tears in their eyes, sharing stories that echoed aspects of my own experience, the dismissal of their financial acumen, the struggle to build security within limiting circumstances, the yearning for independence often deferred but never completely abandoned. Eventually, I found my way to William and Elizabeth, who waited patiently as I navigated the crowd of well-wishers. "Mom," William embraced me warmly. "That was extraordinary. You're a natural teacher." "Thank you for coming." I squeezed his hand gratefully before turning to Elizabeth, whose expression was complicated, pride and lingering resistance competing for dominance. That was... She hesitated, searching for words. Not what I expected. "In what way?" I asked. "I thought you'd be bitter, vengeful even, using this platform to settle scores with Dad." Elizabeth's honesty was refreshing. But it wasn't about him at all. It was about empowerment, about helping other women avoid the constraints you faced. "Exactly," I confirmed. "This journey stopped being about your father the moment I left Cedar Grove. It's been about reclaiming myself ever since." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I spoke with Dad," she admitted, "about the settlement. Told him it was time to accept reality and move forward with dignity." "Thank you," I said simply. "That couldn't have been an easy conversation." "It wasn't," she confirmed, "but necessary, for all of us." As we left the convention center together, my children flanking me like protective escorts, I reflected on the year's extraordinary transformation. From dutiful Mrs. George Hampton, defined by my service to others, to Margaret Wilson, financial educator and keynote speaker, valued for my mind and experiences. "Where to now?" William asked as we reached the street. "Dinner to celebrate?" "Actually," I replied, making a spontaneous decision, "I'd like you both to see my new home. I've been in Philadelphia nearly a year, and neither of you has visited. My condominium." They exchanged glances, silently negotiating. "Lead the way," Elizabeth said finally. My Rittenhouse Square condominium, once minimally furnished in those early days of independence, had evolved into a space that reflected my authentic aesthetic. contemporary art on walls that had never hosted traditional hunting scenes, vibrant, textiles replacing the subdued palette George had preferred, bookshelves filled with financial texts and literary novels I'd always enjoyed but relegated to private reading. "This is unexpected," Elizabeth commented, surveying the space with evident surprise. "It's so modern." "It's me," I explained simply. "The visual representation of who I am when not conforming to someone else's expectations." As I prepared, a simple dinner for my children, another reclaimed pleasure, cooking what delighted me rather than impressed others, we talked more openly than we had in years. Elizabeth shared challenges in her marriage, particularly the strain of balancing her executive career with her husband James's expectations of traditional wife support. William described a promising new architectural commission, his passion for the work evident in his animated descriptions. "I've been meaning to ask," William said as we lingered over dessert. "Have you thought about what you'll do with your portfolio long term? It's substantially more than you'll need for your own security." The question was pertinent. At 73, with a $3.7 million portfolio generating significant income and modest living expenses, my financial future included an inevitable surplus. "I've been developing some ideas," I admitted. "A foundation, perhaps, supporting financial literacy for women from disadvantaged backgrounds, scholarships for female economics students, programs helping women transition from financial dependency to autonomy." Elizabeth's financial mind engaged immediately. "You should establish a proper trust structure," she advised. "Maximize the impact while minimizing tax implications." "You sound like a banker," I teased gently. "I am a banker," she replied with the faintest smile. The observation warmed me unexpectedly. Despite our differences, despite her initial alignment with George, Elizabeth was acknowledging a connection between us, a shared aptitude I'd suppressed in service to my marriage, while she had developed hers into a successful career. "I see a lot of myself in you," I told her. "The self I might have been had I come of age in a different time." Elizabeth nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. "I still don't agree with how you handled this," she said after a moment. "But I'm beginning to understand why." It wasn't full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of incomprehension that had separated us since my departure from Cedar Grove. As we prepared to leave, Elizabeth hesitated. "Dad's dating someone," she blurted, watching my face carefully for a reaction. "Vivian Sutton, from the country club board." I absorbed this information, searching my feelings and finding genuine neutrality. "I hope she makes him happy," I said, sincerely. Elizabeth seemed surprised by my lack of jealousy or resentment. "That's it? You don't care?" "I want George to have a good life," I explained. "Just not at the expense of mine anymore." Outside the restaurant, as we prepared to part ways, Elizabeth asked the question that perhaps had motivated her visit all along. "Are you really happy, Mother? Living alone? Starting over at your age?" I considered the past 6 months, the freedom to make choices based solely on my own preferences, the intellectual stimulation of teaching financial literacy, the genuine connections formed with women who saw and valued me for my actual capabilities rather than my performance of traditional femininity. "I'm happier than I've been in 50 years, I answered truthfully. Not because being alone is inherently better than being married, but because being authentically myself is better than living as someone else's accessory." Elizabeth nodded slowly, processing this perspective that so fundamentally challenged the family narrative she'd grown up with. "William's coming to your keynote address," she said abruptly, "at the financial conference next month. You know about that?" I was surprised. I hadn't mentioned it to either of my children. "I'm on the board of a bank, Mother. Financial industry events don't escape my notice." A hint of her usual crisp efficiency returned. "I was quite surprised to see your name on the program." "Will you attend?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the hope rising within me. Elizabeth hesitated. "I'll try," she said finally. "My schedule is complicated, but I'll try." It wasn't a promise, but it was more than I'd dared expect when the evening began. In the weeks leading up to the conference, I worked diligently on my keynote address, determined to honor the opportunity to share insights gleaned through 50 years of financial strategizing. The speech needed to balance personal narrative with practical guidance, inspiration with actionable steps, validation of women's financial challenges with pathways to overcome them. I titled it Hidden Assets: Building Financial Independence from Within Traditional Constraints, a deliberate double entendre referencing both my secret portfolio and the unrecognized capabilities so many women possess, yet rarely receive credit for. 2 days before the conference, I received a surprising email from my attorney, Patricia Delaney. George had abruptly changed his approach to our divorce negotiations, withdrawing his objections to my separate financial status and proposing a clean, amicable settlement. "This is unexpected," Patricia noted in her message. I considered leaving many times over the years," I admitted. "When you were 10 and your father dismissed my suggestion that I return to school. When William was struggling to pursue architecture against George's wishes. When I turned 50 and realized half my life had passed without me ever making a significant decision independently." "Then why stay so long?" she challenged. "Initially, for you and William. Then to build enough financial security to truly stand on my own. Finally." I hesitated, searching for words that would convey the complex psychology of a decades-long accommodation without sounding like excuses. Inertia is powerful, Elizabeth. The longer you inhabit a role, the harder it becomes to imagine yourself outside it. "Until Dad's anniversary toast," she supplied, her tone skeptical. "The toast crystallized something I'd known for years," I explained. "That your father never saw me as a complete person with my own value, only as an extension of himself, valued for my service to his needs and image." Elizabeth flinched slightly, perhaps recognizing echoes of her father's attitude in her own marriage. "Still," she argued, "the way you left, the secret money, it feels deceptive." "The portfolio wasn't about deception," I clarified. "It was about survival, about creating something that was truly mine in a marriage where everything else belonged to your father." $7 million, mother." Elizabeth's banking background emerged in her precise citation of the amount. "That's not a rainy day fund. That's a deliberately hidden fortune." "Hidden, yes. Stolen, no," I corrected gently. "Every dollar came from legitimate household funds given to me to manage. I simply managed them more efficiently than your father realized was possible." Elizabeth's financial mind engaged despite her emotional resistance. "Even so, the growth is remarkable. From household budget savings to millions, the investment performance must have been exceptional." "Compound growth over 5 decades," I explained. "Consistent contributions, dividend reinvestment, strategic adjustments during market cycles. The principles aren't complicated, just consistently applied over an unusually long time frame." She studied me with new awareness, perhaps seeing beyond the mother who had arranged perfect birthday parties and maintained immaculate holiday traditions to the financial strategist who had operated undetected within that domestic role. "Dad never knew," she said slowly. "Never suspected you had this capacity." "Your father saw what he expected to see," I replied. "And he expected to see a decorative wife who managed his household, not an investment strategist who could build financial independence." Our conversation continued through dessert, Elizabeth's initial hostility gradually softening into reluctant curiosity. She asked detailed questions about my investment approach, my risk management strategies, my portfolio allocation. The banking executive momentarily overtaking the resentful daughter. "You know," she said finally, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, I always wondered where my facility with numbers came from. Dad's good with people, with persuasion, with strategic relationships. But the pure analytical thinking, I never saw that in him. Both receiving and expressing it. The carefully filtered communication style I'd cultivated as Mrs. George Hampton, designed to anticipate and avoid conflict, had gradually given way to something more authentic. "I'll consider it," I promised. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner in my Rittenhouse Square kitchen, another simple pleasure reclaimed, cooking only what appealed to me rather than what would impress George's colleagues, the significance of the invitation settled into proper perspective. My workshops had already helped dozens of women in Philadelphia take small steps toward financial autonomy. A keynote address could extend that impact nationally. I emailed the conference organizers my acceptance. The following week brought another unexpected development. William called to inform me that Elizabeth had finally expressed interest in speaking with me. Since my departure from Cedar Grove, my relationship with my daughter had consisted primarily of terse text messages and occasional updates about the grandchildren relayed through William. "She's still angry," William warned, "but I think she's starting to question Dad's version of events. Some things aren't adding up for her." "What kind of things?" I asked. "Dad's struggling without you, not emotionally so much as practically. The house is disorganized, social obligations are falling through cracks, his daily routine is chaotic. Elizabeth's been trying to fill the gap, but she's realizing how much you actually managed behind the scenes." This didn't surprise me. George had always taken for granted the invisible infrastructure I maintained, the perfectly orchestrated household, the seamless social calendar, the anticipation of his needs before he even articulated them. Only in its absence would the extent of that support become apparent. "She's coming to Philadelphia next Thursday for a banking conference," William continued. "She asked if you'd be willing to meet for dinner." I agreed immediately, equal parts hopeful and apprehensive. Elizabeth had always been more aligned with George's values, achievement-oriented, status-conscious, focused on appearances. My abrupt departure and financial revelation had violated everything she'd been raised to respect about proper behavior, especially for women of our social station. We arranged to meet at Park, a French bistro overlooking Rittenhouse Square. I arrived early, securing a table by the window that offered both privacy for our conversation and a pleasant view of the park in early spring bloom. Elizabeth entered precisely on time, her professional demeanor evident in her tailored suit and carefully controlled expression. "Mother," she greeted me with formal politeness, accepting a brief hug before taking her seat. "You look well," I offered, noting the subtle signs of strain beneath her composed exterior. Shadows under her eyes carefully concealed with makeup. Tension in her shoulders despite her perfect posture. "So do you," she replied, a note of surprise in her voice. "You look different somehow." "Happier," I suggested. "More myself." Elizabeth's expression tightened. "Let's order before we get into all that." We maintained neutral conversation. Through appetizers, updates on her children, my brief descriptions of Philadelphia cultural attractions, careful avoidance of anything substantive. Only after our entrees arrived did Elizabeth finally address the elephant in the room. "Dad is struggling," she began, cutting her salmon with precise movements. "The divorce proceedings are taking a toll." "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied sincerely. "I never wanted to cause him pain, only to claim my own life." Elizabeth set down her fork, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "After 50 years? You couldn't have figured this out decades ago, before everyone was invested in a family structure you've now demolished?" The accusation was expected, her perspective understandable given her limited information. My particular expertise, building financial independence within traditional marriage structures where women often lacked direct economic authority, filled a niche few conventional financial advisors addressed. By December, 6 months after, leaving Cedar Grove, I had established a new identity entirely distinct from Mrs. George Hampton. In Philadelphia's growing community of financially empowered women, I was simply Margaret Wilson, the investment strategist who had built a multi-million-dollar portfolio from household budget savings and now dedicated herself to helping others achieve similar independence. The irony wasn't lost on me that George's dismissive anniversary toast had inadvertently launched me into precisely the kind of meaningful, respected position he had spent decades assuming I was incapable of achieving. His inability to see my value had ultimately freed me to demonstrate that value to a world far beyond Cedar Grove's limited social circles. One evening, after leading a particularly successful workshop for women entrepreneurs, I returned to my Rittenhouse Square condominium to find an unexpected package awaiting me. The return address showed Williams' Chicago architecture firm. Inside was a framed architectural drawing of a small, elegant house overlooking water, modern in design, with clean lines and expansive windows capturing natural light. The accompanying note read simply, "For the woman who built her own foundation. This is how I see you now. Defined by your own vision, not someone else's. Love, William." I placed the drawing on my living room wall, a visual representation of the transformation I'd undergone, from inhabiting spaces designed according to someone else's preferences to creating an environment that expressed my authentic self. Later that night, I stood at my wall of windows overlooking Rittenhouse Square, the city lights glittering against the December darkness. At 72, I had finally claimed the life that had been waiting for me all along, hidden beneath decades of compromise and accommodation. George's anniversary toast echoed in my memory. Margaret has never contributed anything but her time and presence. He had been wrong in ways he could never comprehend. I had contributed discipline, intelligence, strategic thinking, and patience. I had quietly built a fortune while maintaining the illusion of dependency. I had raised children capable of establishing their own paths, even when those paths diverged from Hampton family expectations. And now I was contributing something else, the knowledge painstakingly acquired over 50 years, shared with women who might use it to claim their own independence sooner than I had claimed mine. Outside my window, snow began to fall, transforming the Philadelphia night into a tableau of infinite possibility. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, watching my reflection smile back at me. Not the careful social smile of Mrs. George Hampton, but the genuine expression of a woman finally at home in her own life. This, I realized, was the true measure of wealth, not the $3.7 million portfolio that had enabled my escape, but the authentic self I had reclaimed in the process. The woman I had always been beneath the performative role of corporate wife. The woman George had never truly seen, and therefore could never truly lose. Margaret Wilson, financial strategist, teacher, independent woman, herself at last. 6 months into my new life in Philadelphia, I received an unexpected invitation. The Women's Financial Empowerment Conference, a prestigious national gathering, wanted me to deliver the keynote address at their annual meeting. The email from the organizing committee explained that several attendees of my community workshops had nominated me, citing the profound impact of my personal story and practical approach to financial independence. My first instinct was to decline. Public speaking on such a scale had never been part of my plan. The Margaret Wilson, who had meticulously built a secret portfolio over decades, had valued privacy, discretion, operating in the shadows while George commanded the spotlight. Stepping onto a national stage represented a level of visibility entirely foreign to my experience. "You should accept," urged Diane Chen, my financial advisor, when I mentioned the invitation during our quarterly review meeting. "Your story needs to be heard by women beyond Philadelphia." "I'm not a professional speaker," I protested. "I'm just a woman who saved carefully and invested wisely." Diane fixed me with a knowing look. You're a woman who built a $7 million portfolio starting with $50 while managing a household budget, who maintained absolute financial secrecy for 50 years in a controlling marriage, who reinvented herself completely at 72. False. Modesty doesn't suit you, Margaret. I smiled despite myself. In the months since leaving Cedar Grove, I'd grown accustomed to directness. The insight came unexpectedly during a conversation with my watercolor instructor, a retired art teacher named Sophia. "You have a natural eye for composition," she commented after class one day, examining my latest painting, a study of Rittenhouse, square in morning light. "But you really shine when explaining financial concepts to the other students." I looked at her questioningly. "Financial concepts?" "Last week," she reminded me, "when Marie was worried about retiring on her teacher's pension. You spent 15 minutes breaking down annuity options so clearly that half the class was taking notes. And yesterday, when Thomas mentioned concerns about his daughter's college fund, you outlined tax advantage saving strategies better than any financial advisor I've consulted." I hadn't thought much about those conversations. They were simply natural extensions of knowledge I'd accumulated over decades of private study. But Sophia's observation resonated. I had genuinely enjoyed those discussions, particularly seeing the relief on Marie's face as complex financial concerns became manageable with proper information. "Have you ever considered teaching?" Sophia asked. "The community center offers financial literacy workshops. They're always looking for qualified instructors." The suggestion lingered in my mind long after the class ended. Teaching had never been among my planned post-divorce activities. Yet the idea of sharing knowledge that had empowered me with others who might benefit, particularly women in situations similar to my earlier years, held undeniable appeal. The next day, I contacted the community center's education director and arranged a meeting. Ellen Torres, a brisk, practical woman in her 50s, reviewed my background with growing interest. "Your investment track record is remarkable," she noted, scanning the portfolio summary I'd provided. "And your personal journey, from financially dependent spouse to self-sufficient investor, would resonate with many of our members." "I don't have formal qualifications," I pointed out. "No certifications or degrees in finance." Ellen smiled. 50 years of self-directed learning and a multi-million-dollar portfolio built from household savings are qualifications enough. For our purposes, we don't need another technical expert explaining market theory. We need someone who can translate financial concepts into practical strategies for everyday life, especially for women who've been traditionally excluded from financial education. 2 weeks later, I taught my first workshop, Financial Independence for Women, Starting Where You Are. The community center's classroom was filled beyond capacity, 37 women ranging in age from 20s to 70s, all seeking the financial knowledge that traditional systems had often withheld from them. I began by sharing my own story, not the dramatic departure or the divorce proceedings, but the quieter narrative of a young woman in 1973 opening her first separate bank account with $50 and building from there. I explained the practical strategies I'd developed: stretching household budgets, finding hidden savings opportunities, researching investments thoroughly, reinvesting dividends, maintaining meticulous records. Financial independence isn't just about having money, I told them. It's about having options, the freedom to make choices based on what you truly want, rather than what you can afford to lose. The response was overwhelming. Women stayed long after the scheduled ending time, asking questions, sharing their own financial challenges, requesting resource recommendations. Several approached me privately, confessing situations painfully familiar. Marriages where they had no financial authority, partnerships where their economic contributions were minimized or dismissed. "You've given me hope," one woman in her 60s told me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've been married 42 years and never had a bank account in my own name. Tomorrow, I'm opening one." I left the community center that evening. feeling something I'd rarely experienced in 50 years as Mrs. George Hampton, a sense of meaningful contribution based on my authentic capabilities rather than my capacity to support someone else's ambitions. Within weeks, the workshop series expanded to twice-monthly sessions covering various aspects of financial literacy specifically tailored to women's experiences. I developed specialized modules for different life stages: young professionals, mothers managing family finances, women contemplating divorce, widows handling estates for the first time. As word spread, I received invitations to speak at women's organizations throughout Philadelphia, then at regional conferences focusing on female financial empowerment. To our standing in the community, Elizabeth is devastated. The grandchildren are confused. My colleagues are whispering behind my back. There it was, his true concern. Not losing me, but losing face. The Hampton reputation tarnished by a wife who had dared to want more than the role assigned to her. "I'm sorry the children are struggling," I said sincerely, "but they're adults who will adjust to this new reality. As for the rest, your social standing, your colleagues' opinions, those are your concerns, not mine. I've spent 50 years managing the Hampton image. I'm retired from that position." He stared at me, seeming to truly see me for perhaps the first time. Not the compliant wife, not the efficient homemaker, but a woman with her own mind and will who had outmaneuvered him at his own game. "I don't know who you are," he said finally. I smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange on my face after so many years of careful social expressions. "That's the point, George. You never did." With that, I turned and walked away, Patricia at my side. Outside the courthouse, sunshine bathed the Philadelphia street in golden light. I tilted my face upward, savoring the warmth, the freedom, the sense of a weight finally lifted after decades of patient endurance. "Well done," Patricia murmured beside me. "Many women in your position would have wavered." "I've had 50 years to prepare for that conversation," I replied. There was nothing he could say that I hadn't already anticipated and resolved. In the weeks that followed, my new life took shape with surprising ease. My condominium gradually filled with carefully selected furniture and artwork, contemporary, pieces in bold colors that would have horrified George's traditional sensibilities. I established a daily routine that prioritized activities I enjoyed: morning walks in Rittenhouse Square, afternoons reading or painting, evenings attending concerts or lectures, or simply enjoying quiet solitude with a good book. William visited twice, curious about my new environment and seemingly relieved to find me thriving. During his second visit, he brought his daughter Olivia, now 16 and considering college options. "I want her to see that reinvention is possible, at any age," he explained privately while Olivia explored my condo. "That women can be financially independent, make bold choices, prioritize their own fulfillment. Your father would say you're corrupting her with dangerous ideas," I noted with a smile. William shrugged. "Dad says a lot of things. I've learned to filter." Elizabeth remained distant, communicating primarily through terse text messages updating me on her children's activities. She had fully aligned herself with George, even moving her family temporarily into the Cedar Grove house to help him manage the transition. A euphemism for propping up the Hampton image in the community and ensuring George didn't publicly implode. The divorce proceedings advanced at the stately pace of the legal system. George's initial aggressive tactics gave way to a more strategic approach, as his attorneys recognized the futility of challenging my separate assets. Instead, they focused on minimizing public exposure and negotiating a settlement that would preserve as much of George's dignity as possible. I remained firm on my core position. I wanted only what I had built myself, but proved flexible on peripheral matters. George could announce the separation however he wished to the Cedar Grove community. He could keep all the artwork and furnishings we had acquired together. I even agreed to a joint statement to the children emphasizing mutual respect despite the end of our marriage. These concessions cost me nothing while allowing George to save face, a pragmatic approach Patricia tactfully described as strategically generous. By early autumn, 3 months after walking away from Cedar Grove, I had established a comfortable routine in Philadelphia. My financial situation was secure, my legal position unassailable, my daily life increasingly fulfilling. Yet something was missing, a purpose beyond self-care and personal enjoyment. Everyone at the club is talking about it. The Altar Guild misses you. Father James mentioned your absence specifically on Sunday. I deleted them all without responding. Cedar Grove was my past. I had no obligation to explain or defend my choices to people who had never really known me. The next week passed in a blur of practical arrangements, setting up utilities, ordering furniture, establishing my presence in my new community. I joined the Philadelphia Museum of Art as a patron, enrolled in a watercolor class at a nearby community center, and found a small French bistro where I began taking breakfast each morning, the staff quickly learning my preference for café, au lait and almond croissants. Small pleasures, all of them. Yet each represented a choice made solely for myself, an expression of my own preferences rather than an accommodation of someone else's expectations. After 5 decades of living for others, these modest acts of self-determination felt revolutionary. The court hearing regarding George's attempt to freeze my assets proceeded exactly as Patricia had predicted. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, reviewed our comprehensive documentation and dismissed the motion with barely concealed impatience. "Mr. Hampton," she addressed George's attorney directly, "the evidence clearly establishes these as separately maintained assets accumulated through prudent management of funds that were at your client's wife's discretion. There is no foundation for the court to intervene." George, sitting stiffly beside his lawyer, stared at me across the courtroom with a mixture of disbelief and fury. It was the first time we'd been in the same room since I'd walked out. He looked older somehow, diminished. The invincible patriarch of the Hampton family reduced to an angry old man who had just lost control of a situation for perhaps the first time in his adult life. As we left the courtroom, he attempted to intercept me. "Margaret," he called, his voice carrying in the marble hallway. "This charade has gone far enough. You've made your point. It's time to come home." I paused, allowing him to approach. Up close, the strain was evident, new lines around his mouth, shadows beneath his eyes. For a moment, I felt that unwelcome flicker of sympathy again. "There is no point to make, George," I replied evenly. "This isn't a negotiating tactic or a bid for attention. This is me claiming the life I want for however many years I have left." "After 50 years?" His voice rose incredulously. "You're throwing away half a century over one poorly phrased toast?" "The toast was a symptom, not the cause," I corrected. "It simply confirmed what I've known for decades, that you've never seen me as a full person with my own value. Only as an extension of yourself, a support system for your ambitions." "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "I gave you everything, a beautiful home, financial security, social standing. You gave me the things you valued," I acknowledged. "But you never asked what I might value. And when I demonstrated capabilities you hadn't anticipated, financial, acumen, investment skills, your immediate response was accusation and attempts to seize control." His face darkened. "You deceived me for 50 years. "I survived you for 50 years, I countered. "I created something for myself in the narrow space your ego left available, and now I'm done apologizing for it." George stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to our family?" Of course she was. Elizabeth had always identified more strongly with George, emulating his focus on appearance and status. "She's entitled to her feelings," I replied evenly. I hope eventually she'll understand this isn't about hurting your father. It's about finally living my own life. I get that, William said. I really do. But Mom, why now? Why not years ago, when we were grown? Why wait 50 years? It was the question I'd asked myself countless times over the decades. The answer had evolved as my portfolio grew, as my children established their independence, as George's dismissive attitude calcified from casual disregard into entrenched devaluation. At first, it was about you and Elizabeth, I explained. I wanted you to have stable childhoods, and in my generation, that meant intact families regardless of the parents' happiness. Then it became about building enough financial security to truly stand on my own. Finally, it was about finding the courage to walk away from the identity I'd inhabited for so long. The golden anniversary pushed you over the edge, William guessed. Dad's speech. It clarified things, I acknowledged. Hearing him publicly reduce 50 years of my life to time and presence, it crystallized what I'd known privately for decades. In his eyes, I had no value beyond my service to him. I wish I'd stood up when he said that. William's voice held regret. Called him out on it. This isn't your battle, I assured him. It's mine, and I'm handling it in my way. After promising to visit him in Chicago once I was settled, I ended the call feeling cautiously optimistic about at least one family relationship surviving this transition. William had always been more perceptive than his father or sister, more willing to question the Hampton way of doing things. That afternoon, Patricia called with an update. Your husband's attorney has filed an emergency motion seeking to freeze your separate assets, she reported. They're claiming the funds represent marital property that was hidden and misappropriated. As expected, I said calmly. We've filed our response with full documentation of the source of funds. The judge has scheduled a hearing for next week, but based on the strength of our evidence, I'm confident the motion will be denied. And in the meantime? You have complete access to your accounts, Patricia confirmed. The burden is on them to prove these were not legitimately separate assets, and they won't be able to do that. I thanked her and hung up, relieved but not surprised. George's reaction was predictable. When challenged, he attacked. When defeated, he sought to control the narrative. The next phase would be attempting to damage my reputation, I suspected. A preemptive strike against whatever community standing I might establish in my new life. Sure enough, by evening, my phone buzzed with messages from mutual friends in Cedar Grove, their tones ranging from concerned to accusatory. Margaret, George tells us you're having some kind of breakdown. We're so worried. Please call. Is it true you've been hiding money for years? Many women in your position find themselves searching for purpose beyond financial security. The question caught me off guard. For 5 decades, my purpose had been defined by serving others, George, the children, the community as an extension of the Hampton name. My secret financial activities had been my only outlet for my intellect and capabilities. Now, possibilities stretched before me. Limitless, and if I were honest, somewhat intimidating. I haven't decided, I admitted. For now, establishing. My new life seems purpose enough. The next morning, I received the keys to my Rittenhouse Square condominium. The 2-bedroom unit on the 12th floor featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park, hardwood floors, and a sleek, modern kitchen, a deliberate departure from the traditional dark-wooded Hampton aesthetic. I had purchased only minimal furniture in advance: a bed, a sofa, a dining table with chairs. The rest I would select over time, each piece chosen because it appealed to me rather than projecting an appropriate image. As I stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, my phone rang. William. At least the 3rd time he'd called since yesterday. This time I answered. Mom. He sounded relieved. Thank God. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I assured him. "Better than fine, actually. I'm in my new place in Philadelphia." "Dad is..." He hesitated. I've never seen him like this. Between the divorce and discovering your secret finances, he's practically incoherent. Elizabeth is with him now, trying to calm him down. I felt a flicker of sympathy, quickly suppressed. "He'll adjust. Your father has always been adaptable when necessary." "He's saying you stole from him," William continued, "that you must have been siphoning money from his accounts for years." I sighed, unsurprised but disappointed. "That's absolutely false, as the financial records clearly show. I simply managed the household budget more efficiently than he realized was possible, and invested the difference." "I believe you," William said quickly. "Actually, I'm kind of impressed. $3, $7 million from household savings? That's remarkable." "Thank you," I said, unexpectedly touched by his assessment. "It required a lot of discipline and research. Elizabeth doesn't see it that way," he warned. "She's firmly on Dad's side. Says you betrayed the family, humiliated Dad publicly, abandoned your responsibilities." I could imagine the scene, George's face reddening, his voice rising, his control slipping in a way he rarely allowed in professional settings. "Did he mention the portfolio?" I asked. "Oh, yes." Patricia's tone was grimly satisfied. That particular revelation apparently required him to sit down abruptly. His assistant brought him water. The courier reports he kept saying, "This isn't possible," and "She couldn't have done this." The disbelief was predictable. George's entire worldview rested on his superiority: intellectual, financial, strategic. The idea that his decorative wife had built a multi-million-dollar portfolio right under his nose challenged that self-image. At its foundation. "What happens next?" I asked. "He'll likely contact his attorney immediately. Expect aggressive moves initially, attempts to freeze assets, demands for forensic accounting, possibly even allegations of hidden marital assets. Standard tactics when men like your husband feel threatened." "But they won't succeed," I confirmed. "Not with the documentation you've provided. Your separate accounts, the consistent pattern of deposits from your household funds, the tax returns. It's all exceptionally well organized. Mr. Hampton may bluster, but legally, your position is strong." After ending the call, I spent the afternoon exploring my new city, wandering through Rittenhouse Square Park, browsing in small boutiques and bookstores, enjoying a solitary lunch at a sidewalk cafe. The anonymity was intoxicating. In Cedar Grove, I was perpetually performing the role of Mrs. George Hampton, conscious of being observed and judged by a community where the Hampton name carried significant weight. Here in Philadelphia, I was simply an elegant older woman enjoying a pleasant day, my identity entirely my own. By late afternoon, the expected barrage began. Notifications of increasingly urgent voicemails and text messages from George, each more demanding than the last. "Margaret, call me immediately. This ridiculous prank has gone far enough. Your behavior is embarrassing the entire family. Come home now and we'll forget this happened. Where did this money come from? What have you done?" I silenced my phone without responding and continued my exploration of the city. Tomorrow would bring confrontation enough. Today was for savoring my first taste of freedom. That evening, I had dinner at the hotel's restaurant, where I met my new financial advisor for the first time. Unlike Alan, who had managed my secret portfolio for decades, Diane Chen specialized in advising women in transition, divorced, widowed, or newly wealthy. "Your portfolio is impressively structured," she commented after introducing herself. "Diversified, tax-efficient, with an excellent balance of growth and income investments. You clearly know what you're doing." "I've had a lot of time to learn," I replied. "Nearly 50 years of reading every investment book and financial journal I could discreetly access." Diane smiled. Well, it shows. Many of my clients come to me with settlements or inheritances, but little knowledge of how to manage them. You're starting from a position of strength. We discussed my financial goals for the next phase of my life, maintaining my comfortable independence, eventually establishing trusts for my grandchildren, perhaps funding a scholarship at Riverdale University for women pursuing finance degrees. Have you considered what you want to do besides manage your money? Diane asked. I let the calls go to voicemail. Tomorrow would bring enough confrontation. Tonight was for me alone. Before sleeping, I removed my wedding ring, a substantial diamond in a platinum setting that had been upgraded 3 times throughout our marriage as George's financial status improved. I placed it on the hotel room desk alongside the anniversary diamond necklace. Both would be returned to him via Patricia, a final severing of our material connections. My hand felt strange without the ring that had encircled my finger for 50 years. Lighter. The indentation in my skin would take time to fade, but it would, eventually. Just like the identity of Mrs. George Hampton would gradually give way to whatever Margaret Wilson chose to become in this final chapter of her life. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought of my mother's words from so long ago. A woman should always have something that's just hers. Something no one can take away. She had been thinking of financial security, of protection against abandonment. But I had created something far more significant, the foundation for a completely self-determined life. And tomorrow, at 72, that life would finally begin. The morning after I left the Hampton residence, I awoke in my hotel room feeling strangely light. For the first time in decades, I had no responsibilities to anyone but myself. No breakfast to prepare, no social calendar to manage, no husband's needs to anticipate. I ordered room service and savored every bite of my Belgian waffle while watching the morning news, something George had never allowed during breakfast. Mealtimes are for conversation, he'd insist, though his version of conversation typically involved him issuing directives for my day while scanning the newspaper. My phone had accumulated 17 missed calls overnight, 12 from George, 3 from Elizabeth, and 2 from the Whitmores, presumably wondering why we'd missed dinner. I texted William briefly, confirming I was safe and would call him later. To everyone else, silence seemed the most dignified response. By 9 o'clock, I was on the highway to Philadelphia, my car containing only 2 suitcases of clothing and personal items, plus a small box of truly irreplaceable mementos, my mother's recipe book, photographs of the children growing up, a few pieces of my own artwork that George had never deemed worthy of framing. Everything else I'd accumulated over 50 years of marriage remained in Cedar Grove. Most of it had never really been mine anyway, selected to project the image George wanted rather than reflecting my actual tastes or preferences. Patricia had arranged for a private courier to deliver the divorce papers to George's office at precisely 10:30 a.m., when his executive assistant confirmed he would be between client meetings. By my calculation, I would be crossing the Pennsylvania state line just as George was reading the document that would shatter his perception of our marriage and his control over my life. I tried to imagine his reaction. Initial disbelief, certainly. Then outrage. Would there be hurt beneath the anger? Perhaps, though not from losing me as a person so much as losing the support system I represented. George Hampton didn't love me. He loved what I did for him, the role I played in maintaining his image and comfort. The distinction was crucial. My new condominium in Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square neighborhood wouldn't be ready for occupancy until tomorrow, so I'd booked a suite at the Warwick Hotel for one night. As I checked in, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from Patricia Delaney. "It's done," she said without preamble when I answered. "The papers have been served." How did he react? I couldn't help asking. According to our courier, with complete shock, followed by denial. He claimed there must be some mistake, that his wife of 50 years would never do this. When the courier confirmed the documents were indeed legitimate, Mr. Hampton became quite vocal. "You're 72 years old. What are you going to do? How will you support yourself? Where will you live?" These were precisely the questions I'd anticipated from my practically minded daughter. "I have resources of my own," I said simply. "And I've leased a condominium in Philadelphia." "Resources? What resources? Dad has always handled the money." The confusion in her voice would have been comical under different circumstances. "Elizabeth," I said gently, "there's a great deal about me you don't know. I've maintained separate finances for nearly 50 years. I have substantial investments that will more than support me." Another long silence. "That's not possible." "It's not only possible, it's fact. My portfolio currently stands at $7 million. I heard what sounded like a chair scraping, as if she'd needed to sit down. "Mom, are you having some kind of episode? Should I call someone?" The condescension in her tone, so reminiscent of her father's, stiffened my resolve. "Call William," I suggested. "I'd rather explain this to both of you together. Can you conference him in?" Minutes later, William joined our call. I explained again, more comprehensively this time, the decades of separate investing, the anniversary speech that had crystallized my decision, the divorce filing. William spoke first after my explanation. "I can't say I'm completely surprised," he said slowly. "Not about the money, that's astonishing, but about you wanting something different. There's been a sadness about you for as long as I can remember." Elizabeth wasn't processing as calmly. "This will destroy Dad," she argued. "His reputation, his standing in the community. The Hampton name means something in Cedar Grove." "The Hampton name will survive," I assured her, "but I won't continue living as an appendage to it." "What about us?" Elizabeth demanded. "Have you thought about how this affects your children? Your grandchildren?" "I've thought about little else," I admitted. "And I've concluded that the greatest gift I can give all of you is the example of a woman who finally values herself enough to seek happiness, even at this stage of life." "Happiness?" Elizabeth repeated incredulously. "You've been married for 50 years. You have a beautiful home, financial security, social standing. What more could you possibly want?" "To be seen," I answered simply. "To be valued for my mind, not just my domestic capabilities. To live authentically as myself, not as an extension of your father." William sighed. "I understand that, Mom. I really do." "You would," Elizabeth snapped. "You've always encouraged individualism over family responsibility. And you've always prioritized appearances over authenticity," William shot back. "Just like Dad." I interrupted before their long-standing tensions could escalate further. "I'm not asking for your approval," I said firmly. "I'm informing you of my decision out of respect. How you process this is your choice. But I hope, in time, you'll both understand and perhaps even be proud of me." The call ended shortly after, with Elizabeth still protesting and William promising to call me later for a one-on-one conversation. I sat in my car in Patricia's parking lot, emotionally drained but resolute. The first hurdle had been cleared. My children now knew. Tomorrow, George would learn the full extent of my independence. I checked into a hotel near the interstate, a nondescript place where I was unlikely to encounter anyone from our social circle. Tomorrow morning, I would drive to Philadelphia and begin my new life. Tonight, I would give myself one evening of solitude to mark the transition. In my hotel room, I opened my laptop and logged into my investment account. Not the secret one managed by Alan all these years, but a new one established with a Philadelphia-based financial advisor recommended by Patricia. The transfer of assets was already underway, the full balance expected to be available within days. On the screen, the numbers reflected decades of disciplined saving, strategic investing, and compound growth. 3,824 of 856 dollars. 27. The tangible proof of a financial acumen no one in my life had ever acknowledged or valued. I thought of George, who would by now be realizing I wasn't coming home for dinner with the Whitmores. Would he be concerned? Annoyed? Perhaps both. By this time tomorrow, those emotions would be replaced by shock, then rage, then the particular humiliation of a man discovering his wife not only didn't need him, but had outsmarted him for decades. I felt no triumph at the thought, only a profound sense of liberation. The secret was exhausting to maintain, a hidden life running parallel to my visible one. Now, finally, I could align the two, could be openly who I had always been privately. I ordered room service, enjoying the novelty of selecting exactly what I wanted without considering anyone else's preferences. As I ate, I browsed online home furnishing sites, planning the decor for my Philadelphia condominium. Modern, I decided. Clean lines, bold colors, contemporary art. Nothing like the traditional, stuffy Hampton aesthetic I'd maintained for half a century. My phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the evening, George calling with increasing frequency as he realized something was genuinely amiss. For the next hour, we reviewed the divorce filing one final time. I had opted for a straightforward approach. I would claim only my separate property, making no demands on George's assets or retirement accounts. The house in Cedar Grove, the vacation property in Nantucket, the art collection, the cars, he could keep them all. I wanted only what I had built myself, my portfolio, my personal possessions, and my freedom. This is extremely generous, Patricia noted. Most spouses in 50-year marriages would be entitled to a substantial portion of jointly accumulated assets. I don't want a protracted battle, I explained, and I don't need his money. I have my own. He's unlikely to accept this without a fight, she warned. Men like George Hampton don't relinquish control easily. Once the initial shock passes, his concern for public perception will take precedence, I predicted. George cares about his image above all else. A messy divorce at this stage of his career would damage the Hampton legacy he's so carefully constructed. Patricia looked skeptical, but didn't argue. The papers will be served to him at his office tomorrow morning. We chose that location deliberately. He's less likely to create a scene in a professional environment. I nodded, appreciating the strategic thinking. And I'll be safely in Philadelphia by then, she finished. As we discussed, I signed the divorce petition with a steady hand, feeling a curious blend of relief and trepidation. For so long, my identity had been defined by my role as Mrs. George Hampton. Tomorrow, I would begin discovering who Margaret Wilson truly was. As I left Patricia's office, my phone rang, Elizabeth calling, unusual during her workday. Mom? Her? Voice was perplexed. Dad just called me, sounding confused. He said something about you saying goodbye oddly this morning. Are you okay? I took a deep breath. I hadn't planned to tell the children until after George was served with the divorce papers. But perhaps this was better, hearing from me first. I'm fine, Elizabeth. Better than fine. But there are changes coming, and I wanted you to hear about them from me. Changes? Her voice sharpened, the investment banker's instinct for significant developments activating. What kind of changes? I decided on directness. I'm divorcing your father. The papers will be filed today. Silence stretched across the phone line, followed by a disbelieving laugh. That's not funny, Mom. It's not meant to be, I replied calmly. After 50 years of marriage, I'm claiming the independence I've wanted for a very long time. This is absurd, Elizabeth's voice rose. 50 years, he began, raising his champagne flute. Half a century sharing my life with Margaret. What followed was not so much a tribute to our marriage as a retrospective of George's career and accomplishments, with me featured as a supporting character in his biography. He recounted landmark cases he'd won, clients he'd secured, professional honors he'd received. He detailed the financial security he'd built, the social position he'd established, the legacy he'd created for our children. Through it all, he continued, turning toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, Margaret has been my steadfast support, the perfect partner for a man with ambition. She's maintained our home, raised our children, hosted countless dinners that cemented important relationships. Thanks to me, she's never had to worry about finances or difficult decisions. I've handled all of that. He raised his glass higher, his voice carrying across the silent room. Margaret has never contributed anything but her time and presence. And for that quiet constancy, I am grateful. To 50 years with my elegant, undemanding wife. The room applauded politely. Our friends and family smiled, apparently hearing a compliment where I recognized the profound dismissal that it was. A half-century reduced to time and presence. A life measured solely by its service to someone else's ambitions. I maintained my composed smile, accepting the toast with a small nod, while inside, decades of resentment crystallized into cold resolve. There would be no reconsideration, no last-minute sentimentality about our shared history. George had just publicly confirmed what I'd known privately for years. In his eyes, I was an accessory to his success, not a person of independent value. Later that night, as George accepted final congratulations from departing guests, William approached me in a quiet corner of the ballroom. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his artist's eye perhaps more attuned to nuance than his sister's. Dad's speech was revealing, I supplied when he hesitated. William nodded, uncomfortable. I just want you to know that's not how I see you, or what I'll teach Olivia about her grandmother's life. I squeezed his hand, touched by his perception. Thank you, William. That means more than you know. For a moment, I considered confiding in him, telling him about the portfolio, about tomorrow's divorce filing, about the new life I'd planned. But that would place him in an impossible position between his parents. Better to let events unfold, naturally, to explain once the process was underway. I'm fine, I assured him. More than fine, actually. He studied me curiously but didn't press further. William had always been sensitive to boundaries, perhaps because his own had been so often disregarded by his father. At home that night, George was ebullient, the celebration having confirmed his self-image as a man of consequence, celebrating a marriage that reflected his success. Everyone said it was the event of the year, he declared, loosening his bow. Tie? Hampton anniversaries set the standard in this town. It certainly made an impression, I agreed mildly. Your dress was perfect, he continued, appraising me as one might a well-chosen accessory. Exactly right for a woman of your age and position. I smiled thinly. I'm glad it met with your approval. The next big celebration will be my 75th birthday next year, he mused, already planning. We should book the club early to secure the date. You should, I replied, the subtle shift to second person. Singular lost on him. I slept in the guest room that night, claiming a migraine. George didn't question it. Physical intimacy had become perfunctory years ago, scheduled like his dental appointments, another box checked on his life management calendar. Morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect July day. I rose early, dressed, with care in a cream linen suit, and prepared breakfast as I had for thousands of mornings. George came down at his usual time, accepted his customary black coffee and toast, and retreated behind his newspaper. I have a hair appointment at 10, I mentioned casually. Then lunch with the garden club committee. He nodded absently, not looking up from the financial section. Don't forget we have dinner with the Whitmores tonight, 7:30. I remember, I said, gathering my purse and car keys. Have a good day, George. He grunted in response, already absorbed in market reports. It was the last ordinary morning of our marriage, though only I knew it. By the time George arrived home that evening, expecting me to be dressed for dinner with the Whitmores, I would be in Patricia Delaney's office, signing the final divorce papers. By tomorrow, George would be served with legal documents revealing both the end of our marriage and the existence of my multi-million-dollar portfolio. I paused at the door, taking one last look at the tableau, George Hampton at the head of his breakfast table, confidently planning a future that was about to implode. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something like pity. His entire identity was built on being the provider, the decision-maker, the man whose wife needed him for financial security. How would he process the revelation that for nearly 50 years, I had been quietly building my own security? Then I remembered his anniversary toast, the public diminishment of my existence to mere time and presence. The flicker of sympathy extinguished. "Goodbye, George," I said softly. He looked up, momentarily confused by my tone. "You'll be back for dinner?" I smiled, a real smile for the first time in longer than I could remember. "No," I said simply. "I won't." Before he could respond, I walked out the door, closing it firmly behind me. Not just on the house, but on 50 years of a life lived according to someone else's expectations. I drove not to the hair salon, but directly to First National Bank of Westfield, where I accessed my safe deposit box one final time. Inside lay decades of financial statements documenting the growth of my separate portfolio, organized chronologically and annotated with the source of every deposit. Also inside was a smaller box containing my grandmother's jewelry, pieces I'd kept separate from the collection George had given me over the years, family heirlooms that predated my marriage. From there, I proceeded to Patricia Delaney's office, in a discreet professional building on the outskirts of Cedar Grove. Her assistant showed me immediately into a conference room where Patricia waited with the finalized divorce papers. "Are you ready, Mrs. Hampton?" she asked, studying me carefully. "More than ready," I replied, setting my documentation on the table. "And please, call me Margaret Wilson. It's time I reclaimed my name along with my independence." Patricia smiled approvingly. "Very well, Ms. Wilson. Let's proceed. Elizabeth and William will bring their families, of course. I'm thinking formal, black tie, a proper celebration of a Hampton milestone." I sipped my coffee, mentally calculating how much longer I needed to play this role. 6 months until the anniversary, then freedom. The preparations consumed the spring of 2022. George hired an event planner, but insisted I oversee every detail: the guest list, the menu, the music, the floral arrangements. "No one knows our history like you do, Margaret," he said, as if conferring a great honor on me. I complied, moving through the planning process with practiced efficiency. Meanwhile, I was preparing for a very different future. I consulted discreetly with Patricia Delaney, a divorce attorney known for representing women in high-net-worth separations. I researched condominiums in Philadelphia, a city I'd always admired for its blend of history and culture, and far enough from Cedar Grove to avoid awkward social encounters. I began digitizing and organizing financial records documenting my separate assets. "Mrs. Hampton," Patricia had said during our first meeting, "your situation is unusual but not unprecedented. Long-term marriages where one spouse has maintained separate finances often involve complex emotions as well as legal challenges." "I'm not concerned about the emotions," I told her truthfully. "Those died years ago. I just want a clean break and protection of my assets." She nodded, making notes. "The fact that you've maintained this portfolio in your maiden name, with a separate address, using funds that were effectively your own discretionary budget, strengthens your position considerably. However, you should prepare for your husband to contest this arrangement." "George hates public embarrassment more than anything," I replied. "Once he realizes I'm serious, he'll negotiate to keep this quiet." By June, 1 month before our anniversary, my preparations were complete. I had signed a lease on a Philadelphia condominium overlooking Rittenhouse Square, arranged for the transfer of my investment accounts to a new financial advisor based there, and finalized divorce papers with Patricia, ready to be filed the day after our anniversary celebration. All that remained was to play my role one final time, the devoted wife of 50 years, the backbone of George Hampton's success story, the woman who had never contributed anything but her time. The anniversary celebration unfolded exactly as George had planned. The country club ballroom transformed with elegant floral arrangements in cream and gold. A string quartet played as 100 guests in formal attire mingled during the cocktail hour. A 5-course dinner featured George's favorite dishes and wine selected from the club's premium cellar. I wore a custom-designed gown in champagne, silk that had cost more than my first car. An extravagance I permitted myself as a final nod to the role I'd played for so long. Around my neck lay the diamond necklace George had presented that morning, his anniversary gift to me. "Only the best for Mrs. Hampton," he'd said, fastening the clasp. Elizabeth and William arrived with their families. Elizabeth's husband, James, a fellow investment banker. Their twins, Alexander and Sophia, now 12. William's wife, Catherine, an art historian. Their daughter, Olivia, 15, already showing signs of her father's artistic talent. They embraced me warmly, complimented the beautiful celebration, posed for professional photographs arranged strategically around the ballroom. "You've outdone yourself, Mom," Elizabeth said, surveying the elegant scene. "Everything is perfect." If she noticed my distracted smile, she didn't mention it. Elizabeth had always been observant but pragmatic, unlikely to probe beneath surfaces that appeared untroubled. After dinner came the speeches. The managing partner of Hampton, Hampton & Pierce praised George's leadership and vision. A representative from the Cedar Grove Community Foundation thanked him for decades of philanthropic support. Elizabeth spoke eloquently about growing up in a home where excellence was expected and achieved. William offered a more nuanced tribute, acknowledging the complex balance of upholding traditions while finding individual paths. Finally, George stood to address the gathering. Distinguished in his tuxedo, silver hair perfectly styled, he embodied the successful patriarch celebrating a personal triumph. Use them. As the children established their independent lives, Elizabeth in Manhattan's financial district, William eventually at an innovative architecture firm in Chicago, my own secret life expanded. My portfolio crossed the $1 million threshold in 2001, despite the market turmoil following 9/11. I remembered Alan's early advice about long-term thinking and held steady while others panicked, even buying more shares of fundamentally sound companies at depressed prices. George, meanwhile, was approaching the pinnacle of his career. At 60, he became the senior partner of Hampton, Hampton & Pierce after his father's retirement. Our social obligations intensified. Charity galas, political fundraisers, client dinners. I orchestrated them all, the perfect corporate wife, always immaculately dressed, unfailingly gracious, completely invisible as an individual. "Margaret is my secret weapon," George would tell clients, his hand possessively at my waist. 30 years together, and she still runs our home like a Swiss watch. 30 years of marriage, and he had no idea who I really was. No concept of the financial empire I was quietly building alongside his. No inkling that the docile corporate wife harbored the mind of a successful investor who had outperformed many professional fund managers. In 2008, as the global financial crisis unfolded, George's confidence faltered for the first time in our marriage. The firm's revenue dropped as clients pulled back on legal spending. Our investment accounts, managed by the financial advisor George had used for decades, suffered significant losses. "I might need to delay retirement," he confessed one night, reviewing statements at the dining room table. "These losses are substantial." I made sympathetic noises while calculating how my own portfolio was weathering the storm. I had diversified significantly over the years, adding bonds, real estate investment trusts, and international stocks to my holdings. The downturn had affected me, certainly, but my conservative positioning before the crisis had mitigated the worst impacts. "We'll manage," I assured him, pouring another finger of scotch into his glass. "We always do." He patted my hand absently. "At least we don't rely on your financial decisions. Women tend to be too risk-averse in investing. My advisor says that's why they underperform." I bit back a smile, thinking of my 10.2% average annual return over 3 decades. A performance that had exceeded his financial advisor's results by nearly 2 percentage points per year. As George approached 65, retirement discussions became more frequent. He assumed we would sell our Cedar Grove home and divide our time between a penthouse condominium in Naples, Florida, and a smaller residence in Cedar Grove for the summer months. "The Hampton name still carries weight in this town," he explained, as if I might have forgotten after 4 decades. "We'll need to maintain our presence here, even in retirement." I nodded agreeably while privately calculating how long I intended to remain in this marriage once George retired. The thought had been germinating for years that once the children were established, once George's career was complete, I might finally claim my independence. The only question was timing, and increasingly, our 50th anniversary seemed like a fitting milestone. A half-century of service followed by liberation. By 2020, my secret portfolio had grown to an astonishing $3.2 million. The pandemic year accelerated its growth as I strategically invested in technology companies, enabling remote work and healthcare firms developing vaccines. By 2022, as our golden anniversary approached, the balance stood at $3.7 million, far more than I would need to support myself in comfort for the remainder of my life. George, oblivious to my financial independence, proceeded with elaborate plans for our anniversary celebration. "We'll host it at the club," he announced over breakfast one morning. "The same ballroom where we had our wedding reception, full circle." "Whatever you think best," I replied, the words so automatic they required no thought. He didn't notice my detachment, continuing to outline his vision. "We'll invite the firm's partners, key clients, country club friends." "Don't tell Dad," he said quickly, shoving the books under his bed. "He'll just say it's impractical." I sat on the edge of his bed. "Why architecture?" William's face lit up. "It combines everything I love: art, math, design, history. Buildings tell stories, Mom. They shape how people live and work and interact." I thought about our own home, the imposing Tudor that George had chosen primarily to impress clients and colleagues. How its formal spaces dictated a certain kind of living, rigid and presentational. How different our lives might have been in a home designed for connection rather than impression. "Show me your sketches," I said. Hesitantly, William pulled out a portfolio from his closet. Inside were dozens of drawings. Houses, apartment buildings, public spaces. They were remarkable, showing an intuitive understanding of space and proportion. "These are extraordinary, William." He ducked his head, unused to praise for this part of himself. "Dad would hate them. Too modern, too unconventional." "Then we won't tell him yet," I said, making a decision. "But you need proper training." The next day, I withdrew $3,000 from my secret account and enrolled William in a summer architecture program for high school students at Columbia University. To George, I explained that William had received a merit scholarship for a pre-college enrichment program. George was pleased by the prestige of Columbia, not bothering to ask for details about the program's focus. That summer changed William's life. He returned home confident, purposeful, with a portfolio strengthened by professional instruction and a letter of recommendation from the program director. When it came time for college applications, I quietly paid the fees for him to apply to several architecture programs, in addition to the business schools George insisted upon. When the acceptance letters arrived, including one from Cornell's, prestigious architecture program, I helped William prepare his case. We sat George down together, presented the Cornell acceptance alongside the recommendation letters and enhanced portfolio. "This isn't a hobby, Dad," William said, more assertive than I'd ever seen him. "This is what I want to do with my life." George was silent for a long moment, then looked at me. "You knew about this?" "I've seen his talent," I replied evenly. "It's exceptional." After tense negotiations, George reluctantly agreed to Cornell, with the condition that William double major in business. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start, a small crack in the Hampton family tradition, a glimmer of individual choice. That small victory emboldened me. When Elizabeth graduated from Princeton and announced she wanted to pursue investment banking in New York instead of returning to Cedar Grove to join a local financial firm as George had planned, I supported her decision. Privately, "Live your life," I told her during a rare moment alone at her graduation lunch, "not the one planned for you." She looked at me curiously. "Is that what you'd do if you could choose again?" The question pierced me. What would I have done? If I hadn't sublimated my ambitions to George's expectations? If I hadn't funneled my financial acumen into a secret portfolio instead of a visible career? I made my choices, I said carefully. But they were choices shaped by a different time, different constraints. You have more options. William shared humorous anecdotes about our family vacations. Several of George's colleagues toasted his professional achievements and the supportive wife behind the successful man. Then George stood, champagne flute in hand, to deliver the final toast. He looked distinguished in his custom tuxedo, silver hair perfectly coiffed, the very image of success. 50 years, he began, smiling at the assembled guests. Half a century with this woman by my side. He proceeded to chronicle our life together, or rather, his achievements with me as a footnote. His law career, his civic leadership, his skill at navigating us through economic ups and downs. "Margaret has been the perfect partner," he said, briefly acknowledging my presence. Always supportive, never questioning. While I built our financial security, she maintained our home, raised our children, hosted countless dinners that helped advance my career. He turned to me, his expression softening into something between condescension and affection. "She's never had to worry about money or making difficult decisions. I've handled all of that. Margaret's never contributed anything but her time, and for that steadfast presence, I am grateful." The room applauded. Our friends and family beamed. No one seemed to notice what George had actually said, that my half-century of marriage, of motherhood, of community service, of maintaining our social standing amounted to nothing of value. That my contribution was simply being present while he did all the things that truly mattered. I felt something shift inside me. A door long kept ajar, finally swinging fully open. As George raised his glass for the toast, I reached for my purse. Under the table, fingers closing around the business card I'd placed there that morning. The card belonged to Patricia Delaney, a divorce attorney whose reputation for representing women in high-asset divorces had earned her the nickname, the Equalizer. "To 50 more years," George said, looking at me expectantly. I smiled, raised my glass, and took a small sip. But inside, I was already gone. The next morning, while George played golf at the club, I called Patricia Delaney and confirmed our appointment for that afternoon. Then, I went into my closet and removed the false bottom from my old jewelry box, retrieving the key to a safe deposit box at First National Bank of Westfield. 50 years of financial statements, 50 years of investment research, 50 years of building something that was completely, irrevocably mine. As I drove to the bank, I thought about my mother's words all those years ago. A woman should always have something that's just hers, something no one can take away. I had followed her advice beyond her wildest imagination, and now, at 72, I was finally ready to claim not just my money, but my life. As my children grew into teenagers, I refined my investment strategy. Alan, my broker, had become a trusted advisor, impressed by my natural instinct for market trends. "Margaret," he told me during one of our Tuesday meetings, "you have a gift for this. Most clients panic during downturns or get greedy during booms. You stay steady, thinking long-term." I smiled at the compliment. "Patience is something you learn when no one expects anything significant from you," I replied. By 1990, my portfolio had grown to nearly $200,000, an amount that still astonished me when I reviewed my quarterly statements. Elizabeth was preparing for college, touring Ivy League campuses with George, who insisted on accompanying her. "These schools care about legacy connections," he'd explained, dismissing my offer to take her myself. "A Hampton name opens doors." William, 2 years younger, was less enthusiastic about following the Hampton path. He preferred art to economics, sketching to debating. One afternoon, I found him in his room surrounded by architecture books. "How are things with George?" she asked, stirring sugar into her tea. "Fine," I answered automatically. "He's up for senior partner next year." "And you? Are you happy, Maggie?" The question startled me. No one asked about my happiness anymore. I was Mrs. George Hampton. My happiness was assumed, guaranteed by my husband's success. "Of course," I said, but my voice wavered. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were rough, the knuckles swollen from arthritis. "You know, I kept a separate account your father never knew about. Just a little something I put aside each week. When he left, that money kept us from being homeless those first few months." I nodded, remembering the scary weeks after Dad disappeared. How we'd downsized from our small house to an even smaller apartment, but never missed a meal. How Mom had somehow produced first and last month's rent from nowhere. "A woman should always have something that's just hers," she continued, "something no one can take away." On the drive home, her words kept repeating in my head. By the time I pulled into our circular driveway, a seed had been planted. The next day, I opened a separate bank account at First National, using my maiden name, Margaret Wilson. I used the address of a small post office box I rented in Westfield. And I began my parallel financial life with the modest sum of $50 birthday money from my mother. My system was simple but effective. When George gave me money for groceries, I became a master of stretching every dollar. Generic brands, coupon clipping, bulk purchases when items went on sale. I prepared elaborate meals that George could show off to his colleagues, but learned to do it for less than the budgeted amount. The difference went into my secret account. When I needed new clothes for George's firm events, I shopped end-of-season sales and consignment shops instead of the boutiques he assumed I patronized. The savings, hundreds of dollars per outfit, went into my account. When George handed me cash for the children's expenses, I enrolled them in the activities he approved of but found scholarships, early registration discounts, and equipment swaps to reduce the actual costs. The difference went into my account. It wasn't embezzlement or theft. I never took money that wasn't given to me for household purposes. I simply managed it more efficiently than George imagined possible. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using my economics degree after all, just not in the way I'd planned. By 1980, 5 years into my secret saving, I had accumulated just over $5,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. I remembered reading about a new discount brokerage called Charles Schwab that had recently eliminated minimum account balances, making investing accessible to small savers like me. One Tuesday morning, while George was at work and the children at school, I drove to Westfield and visited their small office. The broker, a young man named Alan Parker, seemed surprised when I walked in. Women investors weren't common then, especially women asking detailed questions about commission structures and investment options. "Mrs. Wilson?" he said, using the name on my account application. May I ask what your investment goals are? I hesitated, then decided on honesty. Independence, I said simply. They had become exactly what George had raised them to be, successful Hampton offspring. My portfolio continued to grow, benefiting enormously from the technology boom. By my conservative calculations, it had reached just over $500,000, a sum that still stunned me whenever I reviewed my statements. Then came the dot-com crash, followed by 9/11. Many investors panicked, selling at devastating losses. But my years of secret study had taught me patience. I held my positions, even bought more shares of solid companies at depressed prices. While George complained about the hit to his 401k, I quietly watched my portfolio recover, then continue its upward trajectory. The 2008 financial crisis presented another buying opportunity. By then, my portfolio had crossed the $1 million mark. I was 61, George 64. He began talking about retirement. "I've done well for us," he said one evening, scotch in hand, reviewing his financial statements at the dining room table I'd polished that morning. "We can retire comfortably in a few years. You should start looking at communities in Florida or Arizona. Somewhere warm." I nodded, not mentioning that my own retirement fund now stood at nearly $5 million. That with careful management, I could support myself quite comfortably without ever touching George's money. Instead, I said, "Whatever you think is best, dear." The phrase had become my mantra over 40 years of marriage, a shield behind which I built my secret life, a small surrender that enabled a greater victory. The years that followed brought semi-retirement for George. He kept a few favored clients, mentored junior partners, and focused on his golf game. Our routines shifted but remained fundamentally the same. George made decisions. I implemented them. George earned praise. I stood in his shadow. By 2022, as our 50th anniversary approached, my portfolio had reached a staggering $3.7 million. The once modest sum had grown beyond my wildest expectations, fueled by consistent contributions, smart investments, and the magic of compound interest over half a century. I sometimes wondered what I was waiting for. Why continue the charade when I had more than enough to support myself? Our children were established in their careers, with families of their own. George and I had settled into a polite coexistence, occupying the same space but rarely connecting in any meaningful way. Perhaps it was habit, perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was simply easier to maintain the status quo than to disrupt a 50-year marriage. Then came our golden anniversary celebration. George had insisted on hosting it at the Cedar Grove Country Club, the same venue where we'd held our wedding reception 50 years earlier. He invited 100 guests, colleagues, clients, country club friends, our children, and their families. I spent weeks preparing, selecting the menu, arranging flowers, choosing the perfect dress, a champagne-colored silk that complemented the pearls George had given me on our 25th anniversary. Everything had to be perfect, because perfection was what George expected, what I had delivered for 5 decades. The evening began as planned. Champagne flowed, elegant hors d'oeuvres circulated. A string quartet played our wedding song as we greeted guests in the receiving line. Elizabeth and William arrived with their spouses and children, everyone dressed impeccably and smiling for photographs. After dinner came the speeches. Elizabeth spoke eloquently about growing up with parents who exemplified commitment. Alan nodded, as if this explained everything. Perhaps it did. In that case, I'd recommend a long-term growth strategy. You're young, and time is your greatest asset. With regular contributions and dividend reinvestment, even modest beginnings can grow substantially. And so began my investment education. Alan suggested books, newsletters, and research reports. I devoured them all, hiding the materials in the false bottom of my sewing basket, the one place I knew George would never look. I started with blue-chip stocks, steady, reliable companies that paid dividends which I could reinvest. Johnson & Johnson, Coca-Cola, IBM. Then, as my confidence grew, I added smaller positions in emerging companies I believed had potential. A little-known retailer called Walmart, a computer company named Apple, a coffee chain starting to expand, called Starbucks. Some investments failed. Wang Laboratories seemed promising until it wasn't. But most grew, slowly and steadily, compounding year after year in my secret portfolio. Meanwhile, my visible life continued unchanged. I chaired charity galas, hosted dinner parties, cheered at Williams' lacrosse games, helped Elizabeth prepare for debutante season. I was the perfect corporate wife, supporting George's now meteoric career. By 1985, he was managing partner of Hampton, Hampton & Pierce, with a corner office and a six-figure salary that was exceptional for our mid-sized city. "You're so lucky," my friend Susan Whitmore told me at the club pool one summer day. "George takes such good care of you." I smiled and agreed, thinking of the quarterly statement I'd received the previous week. My portfolio had just crossed $25,000, not enough for true independence, but growing. The children grew too. Elizabeth, intelligent and ambitious like both, her parents, was accepted to Princeton. William, more artistic but aware of family expectations, chose Yale. George was pleased. Hampton children attended Ivy League schools. It was tradition. "I'll handle the tuition," he announced at Elizabeth's high school graduation dinner. "A Hampton education is a Hampton responsibility." I nodded gratefully, not mentioning that my portfolio, now approaching $100,000, could have covered a year or two if necessary. Instead, I redirected the money I'd been saving for their college funds into more aggressive investments. With the children leaving home, I could take more risks. The 1990s arrived, bringing a bull market and a temporarily empty nest. With more time on my hands, I intensified my investment research, making weekly trips to Westfield to meet with Alan, who had become both my broker and my financial confidant. "You have a remarkable talent for this, Margaret," he told me after I suggested investing in Microsoft before its massive growth period. "Have you ever considered doing this professionally?" I laughed. "My husband thinks balancing the household. Checkbook is the extent of my financial acumen." Alan frowned. "That's a waste of potential." I shrugged, used to dismissing such comments. But his words lingered. A waste of potential. How many times had I felt that over the years? How many aspects of myself had I packed away to fit into the shape of Mrs. George Hampton? By 2000, both children had graduated, started careers, and moved to opposite coasts. Elizabeth to New York for investment banking, William to Los Angeles for architecture. They visited dutifully on holidays, bringing impressive partners and stories of demanding careers. "You've never contributed anything but your time." Those words, spoken by my husband of 50 years at our golden anniversary celebration, echoed in the stunned silence of the private dining room. 50 guests watched as George Hampton raised his champagne flute in a toast that felt more like a public execution of my worth. I sat there in my carefully chosen dress, pearl necklace perfectly centered, as 5 decades of marriage were reduced to nothing more than unpaid servitude. What George didn't know, what no one knew, was that the next morning I would visit the attorney I'd already consulted, finalize my divorce papers, and reveal the $37 million portfolio I'd built in absolute secrecy throughout our marriage. I was about to show everyone exactly what Margaret Hampton was capable of contributing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I met George Hampton in 1972 at Riverdale University. I was studying economics with dreams of Wall Street. He was finishing his law degree with a job already lined up at his father's prestigious firm in Cedar Grove. We were both ambitious, both driven. The difference was that society expected George to pursue his ambitions. Mine were considered charming hobbies that would naturally be set aside once we married. "You won't need to worry about a career," George told me on our third date, already planning our future. "Hampton men provide for their wives. You'll never have to work a day in your life." At 22, this sounded wonderful, romantic even. I'd grown up watching my mother struggle with 2 jobs after my father left, constantly exhausted, constantly worried about money. The idea of security, of never having those same fears, was seductive. I mistook George's financial promise for love, his control for care. We married 6 months after I graduated. My economics degree was framed and hung in our guest bathroom, a conversation piece, not a qualification. Within a year, I was pregnant with our first child, Elizabeth. 2 years later came William. My days filled with diapers and domestic duties. My economic models and market analyses replaced with meal planning and playdate schedules. George's career flourished. Hampton, and Pierce grew from a local law firm to a regional powerhouse with offices in 3 states. Our home in Cedar Grove's exclusive Oakwood neighborhood expanded from a modest colonial to a 5-bedroom Tudor with a pool and tennis court. We joined the right clubs, attended the right fundraisers, vacationed at the right resorts. From the outside, I was living the American dream: the successful husband, the beautiful children, the showcase home. But inside that home, something very different was happening. George controlled everything: our finances, our social calendar, our children's education, even what I wore to his firm's events. "Not that dress, Margaret," he would say, barely glancing up from his briefcase. "It's too bright. Wear the navy. One, more appropriate for a partner's wife." My allowance was generous but monitored, with George reviewing the credit card statements each month, questioning any purchase he deemed frivolous. "Do you really need another cookbook? Isn't your job to master the ones you have?" His comments were always delivered with a smile, always framed as teasing or practical advice. Never cruel enough to protest, always sharp enough to sting. Each one a small reminder. This was his money, his house, his life. I was simply living in it. The turning point came in 1975. When Elizabeth was 3 and William just 1. I had taken the children to visit my mother in Westfield, a working-class neighborhood across town. We rarely went there. George considered it depressing and worried about the children picking up bad habits. But my mother had been ill, and even George couldn't object to a duty-bound daughter checking on her sick mother. While the children napped in my old bedroom, Mom and I sat at her kitchen table. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by years of cleaning other people's houses, of stretching every dollar until it screamed.